Alright, next up, Nasatak. Poetry. A compilation. The expedition. I move. There is no compulsion. It is not a need. But something pulls. I cannot deny its draw. The white winds out past my vision. Its fierce eyes watch me as I move. The wolf tracks my step, a silent companion who will not join. All is blank. The pale expanse lies before and behind. I search. The miles pass and still my feet move. My hunt continues unabated. The landscape returns my gaze, unaffected by my presence. The snow falls, needles driven by the wind. Its cold teeth bite my skin. The snow gathers, its hands around my feet. A fierce opponent who will not relent. All is white. My journey continues. I travel. I can no longer stop. A true compulsion forms. The need drives me on. I must see. The sun breaks through the gray. Its unrelenting gaze thaws me. My body warms under its touch. Frigid limbs move again and carry me farther. All is empty. The breath of existence is my destination. Psalm of Wodika. Ye exiles, ye broken, fear not the vengeance of the burned queen. She watches from the throne, ever vigilant. She hears the oath thou doth speak at her altar. She hear the oath thou doth speak in thine home. She hears the oath thou doth speak in the dark. For ye who would keep thy word, thou shalt escape the justice of her gaze. Beware, ye liars, ye unfaithful. Beware, ye with a hardened heart. Beware, for the eye of Wodika will not be blinded. She hears the sundered oath. She is not fooled by the winding path. She attends the broken promise. She sees the deceiver. There is no shadow too dark. Her gaze will find thee. Her justice will not be restrained. The fires of justice will never be quenched. The throne will crack. The law will burn. But the queen that was, always will be. Speak not an untruth, or thy tongue will be bound. Remember thy place. Remember thine oath. Remember thy queen. I have to say, Wodika's really cool, too. I really like Wodika. Selected correspondences of Giftbringer Eden. I think we've read this one. We might have read this one before, but I don't remember for sure. Sing, O ocean waves, of Andra's sorrow, of her unrequited love for the unattainable moon. Sing of the ocean's sorrow, so that we may forget our own. Each day the tides reenact Andra's longing for the great moon. The waters reach out at high tide, yearning for the heavenly body, only to slump into low tide when the moon proves unattainable. You asked me once why I loved Andra so dearly, how I could go from a life on dry land to being a devotee of the goddess of the oceans. I sing of the ocean's sorrow so that I may forget my own. It is Andra's message that speaks to my heart. I have devoted my life to helping others discard painful memories, for that is the gift Andra gave me. When I lost my young daughter, my wife and I were inconsolable until a gift-bearer offered to take my toddler's toys and cast them into the deepest waters. Truth be told, I and the other gift-bearers I know have never even spoken to Andra. She is largely silent, and when she does speak, she uses floods and tidal waves instead of words. But we sing of the ocean's sorrow so that others may forget theirs. Andra's story, the story of desire unanswered, actually matters to people like you and me. Magrin cannot steer you to victory over sadness. Hylia cannot force joy down a crying throat. Only Andra can give us the strength to persevere when life seems without worth. And that is the answer to your question regarding why I love my goddess so dearly. Andra's really cool too. It's just unfortunate that we are kind of against her. Skainite scripture. This is the one we've read before. Yeah, it's a really cool one though. Saint Widewin, farmer becomes god. Ooh, okay. With the mention of the name Widewin, most folk think only one word, Godhammer. While this event echoes through the ages and is still felt years after the destruction of Evondur Bridge, Widewin's humble beginnings belie the powerful force he would grow into. Widewin lived an unassuming life in a remote area of Radsaris, the son of Vorlus farmers. He toiled in the fields alongside his father for 22 years, until his father's death. The farm then fell to him to run. He considered selling, but had no other skills upon which to draw, so he set on the path of Vorlus farmer as well. Nothing of note has been recorded in Widewind's life until 4 years after his father's death. One day, while working the fields, Widewind's life was irrevocably changed, in his words. Night was falling, the fingers of dusk already gripping the sky. The sun had dripped behind the world's edge, and stars were peeking from beyond the shroud. The day was still, and darkness had blanketed the fields. I placed my last harvest of the day into the collection pile, when from behind me arose a brilliant light. I turned, fear in my breast, knowing not what could have caused such intense radiance. Behind me stood a blazing figure, resplendent in glory. Its white flesh glowed with a luminescent radiance, its head a blinding ball of light, brighter than the highest sun of mid-year. I averted my gaze, afraid I would be struck down for daring to gaze upon such a creature. A sudden peace washed over me, sweeping away my fear, leaving my troubled soul tranquil. A loving warmth wrapped its arms around me. A voice spoke to me as I stood, transfixed, trying to both see this glorious being and avoid its dazzling scrutiny. "Fear not," it said to me, "for you are chosen above all others. You will be the light to bring about the rebirth of an empire." It then held out its hand, and bestowed upon me a vision of power such that I could scarcely contain it. Widewind, disheveled and dirty, stumbled into his village the next morning, telling all who would listen about the miracle that had happened in his fields. Aothus himself, he claimed, had appeared to him. It was to punish the Adirian governor for leading his people into ruin. A way would be provided, and those faithful who helped would be blessed when the divinity manifested. Villagers ignored him, convinced the loss of his parents had broken his mind. But Widewind continued to preach of the power of Aothus and the corruption of the governor, eventually earning him the ire of the locals. His confrontations with the villagers hit a turning point one day in mid-autumn. A crowd had gathered around Widewind, jeering him and telling him to leave the village. The Vorlus crop that season was particularly light, and the villagers blamed Widewind, saying he had angered the gods, particularly Aothus, with his blasphemy. They backed him into one of the withered fields, yelling at him to go. Accounts of the inciting action are hazy. Some say a stone was thrown, others say he was pushed. Others still say he simply tripped over a dry root sticking from the ground. Regardless of the cause, Widewind's landed face down on the ground, the villagers standing over him laughing. "Enough!" A voice, not Widewind's, boomed across the field. Widewind looked up at the crowd, his eyes glowing with a blinding white light. He stood, but did not stand. One moment he was on the ground, and the next he was standing before the crowd, who cowered before him. "You dare deny me?" The voice spoke through Widewind's mouth. "You dare refuse my servant?" Widewind's arms raised, beginning to luminesce. "You dare require a proof?" His arms went out to his sides. "Never ask again, lest you be burned in the light of the new dawn." There was a flash of light from Widewind's eyes and hands, and the entire field sprang to life. The once dried and brittle plants became full, lush, and verdant. The crowd was silent. From somewhere in the back came a call of "Praise Aothus," and then they all fell to their knees in front of Widewind, farmer turned god. Well, it was going pretty well for him for a while, huh? Okay, so we got a couple of books on the Adir Empire. What are we, about halfway through? Maybe a little more? Alright. Adir Empire, Part 1, Origin. In approximately 2200 AI, a group of tribes called the People of the... That's only 60 years before Deerwood formed, isn't it? How quickly did these events happen? Anyway, a group of tribes called the People of the Deer unified into a new civilization called the Adir Kingdom. The tribes, small and widespread over the land, knew it would be better for their continued existence to unify. The leaders of each tribe became advisors to the king, chosen by the group. Each advisor would still be lord over his people, but each lord would answer to the fair koning. Fair koning. I was doing pretty well. First king. This decision turned out to be exactly what was needed, and the Deeran kingdom thrived, spreading out over the land, establishing strong trade routes, and became known to be fair but shrewd businessmen. While the country thrived, and internally there was little strife. There were still the occasional skirmishes with the neighboring elven kingdom of Colklin. Not long after the kingdom was formed, the Deeran people began studying Animancy, still largely unknown at that time. It was an exciting, terrifying new realm that Deeran scholars saw great potential in. This potential came to bear fruit in 2260 AI. Maybe I got my dates wrong. When a group of animancers working together transferred the soul of a recently departed man into another body, creating the first of what would later become known as the undead. The reaction to this discovery was swift and decisive. Both the king of Adir and the church of Wodica condemned this event, and the study or practice of animancy was outlawed. It would never again be practiced openly on Adirran soil. Conflicts with Colklin continued, escalating into a minor war in 2398 AI. Afterward, a treaty was signed, and the kingdom of Adir merged with Colklin to form the Adir Empire. With the political and military strife now settled, the Adir Empire would become an economic powerhouse, able to provide resources that were hard to find in other parts of the world. Their trade routes became some of the most lucrative in the world. Good for them. All right, part 2. Expanding borders. In 2602 AI, the Adirran explorers returned from over the ocean, telling tales of the ruins and treasures there, and of expansive fields that were perfect for growing Vorlis. The explorers warned the Furkoning that the locals were not friendly to outsiders, but the Furkoning, seeing this as an opportunity to extend his empire and secure trade on another continent, sent more explorers. I wish we had a map of the land. I wonder if I can find one online to look at. Over the next 20 years, the area that would become the Deerwood was investigated, mapped, and colonized. In 2623, the first permanent Adirran colonial settlements were established. Vorlis fields were set up north of the fortress, or the forest in the Deerwood, but between the conflicts with the Glenfathans and the War of the Broken Stone, it floundered. It wasn't until 2643 that the opportunity presented itself again. Some Eothesian pilgrims, wanting to escape persecution, established colonies and Vorlis farming operations in the territory of Red Saris. With Grand Valia on the verge of collapse, the Furkoning wanted to ensure his hold on the purple dye trade would be established. He encouraged the settlement and even paid to have the pilgrims set up in the New World. Because the Furkoning, and this is a long one, because the Furkoning was still trying to secure his name in the purple dye trade, he was unable to properly respond to Admeth Hadrit when he issued his ultimatum. To avoid a rebellion and leave himself time to oversee the Vorlis farms in Red Saris, the Furkoning relented and made Admeth a grief palatine. In return for this concession, Admeth spent time and resources on the Deerwood's trade and shipping routes, benefiting the Furkoning with increased income. For 7 years, the Deerwood provided Adir with a steady income, leaving the Furkoning time to ensure his trade system in Red Saris was strong. With the Furkoning's attention elsewhere, Admeth instituted the 10 Years' Treaty, ending slavery in the Deerwood and permanently removing one of the revenue sources provided by the Deerwood explorers, the artifacts from the ruins scattered throughout the Deerwood. At this point, the Furkoning's word meant almost nothing to the citizens of the Deerwood. Admeth Hadrit had replaced him as their true leader. In order to undermine Admeth's standing, the Furkoning found allies willing to explore the ruins against the treaty conditions and plunder them. Soon, Adir again had a supply of artifacts to sell. When his agents were eventually caught, the Furkoning distanced himself from the operation, certain that there was no way to link him to the proceedings. But the Grief, using means provided to him by the Glenfathan allies, discovered the evidence needed to prove the Freconing was behind the plunderers. The conflict that arose from this revelation led to Admeth declaring the independence of the Deerwood in 2668 AI. After a bloody 4-year-long war that resulted in the death of Admeth, the Freconing relented, trying to keep control of the Deerwood had become too costly. He signed treaties with the new Duke of the Deerwood and returned his attention to Red Saris, redoubling efforts on the Vorless trade, which is still running today. Nice. Alright, so that's the Adir Empire. Next we have the Dozens. Have another sip of water. Okay, the Dozens. Scarcely a decade ago, on the Evan-Dewar Bridge, 7 men and 5 women fought valiantly to protect their homeland. They volunteered for the mission, knowing it was up to them, and them alone, to prevent Saint Widwin from crossing the bridge. They succeeded, even though they lost all but 4 of their numbers in the battle, and Widwin was on the bridge when the Godhammer detonated. The final 4 were lost in the blast as well, their sacrifice a testament to their dedication. The Dozens, a group ostensibly formed for the protection of Deerwood, was founded in the honor of those men and women. Indeed, those 12 men and women are posthumously regarded by the Dozens as their true founders. Initially, the group dedicated itself to protecting Deerwood from invasion, patrolling the borders tirelessly in search of Red Saris forces regrouping for another attack. When that attack never materialized, many of the Dozens thought that the next threat might come from the Euthesian loyalists living in the Deerwood, and began to turn their attentions within. All new members of the Dozens are required to swear an oath to remember the sacrifice of their founders and remain vigilant against Red Saris and any followers of Eothas. To this end, worshippers of Eothas are routinely harassed by the Dozens. The mindset of this group may be hard for some to understand, as any fanatical devotion can sometimes overshadow the ideals, but the original Dozen knowingly sacrificed their lives for Deerwood. From the Dozens' perspective, how can new members of the Dozens be any less committed to their country's welfare? What better way could there be to honor their founders? The Dozens are not a large group, but what they lack in size they make up in fervent devotion to their cause, and a gift for gaining the ear of commoners. This makes them a force to be reckoned with, and there is no more influential group in shaping the discourse surrounding Widwin's legacy. A small but very vocal minority of extremists in the group are calling for a new war with Red Saris. Talk of purging the Deerwood of all followers of Eothas is also being tooted. More recently, they have begun to see in the practice of Animancy a possible cause to the legacy, and they have taken to the streets of Defiance Bay and the dirt roads of many distant settlements to make their case to the general public. Some point to this as one source of a recent surge in vigilantism and violence in the country. Yep, we're part of the Dozens. Makes it sound like good people, doesn't it? All right, so we got Deerwood History Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, and Part 5, and Part 6. All right, we got the histories coming up. Oh, man, it's going to be a long history, I bet. Okay, well, let's begin. Oh my goodness, how much history can there be? No other land has such a wild and bloody recent history. From colony to Palatinate to Free Republic, the Deerwood has undergone a trial by fire to emerge as a powerful force of the Eastern Reach. Deerwood's history actually begins in Adir in 2602 AI. Adir explorers returned from a journey across the sea with tales of the treasures they'd found. They discovered countless ruins scattered throughout the forest, as well as plains to the north of the trees that would be perfect for growing Vorless. I wonder, it's a bit of a tangent, I wonder if Theos orchestrated the colonizing of Deerwood. I say that because the Adir Empire worships Wodica, right? That'd be interesting. There was a problem, however. The locals were hostile, and there was potential for conflict. The Verkoning of Adir knew that this was too good an opportunity to pass up, and sent more explorers to scout and map the area. Exploration continued over the next 20 years. Small groups of explorers traveled back and forth between Adir and this new world, with a handful of colonists setting up small camps to establish a base for the explorers to work out of. Conflicts with the locals, who the Adirans learned are called the Glenfathans, were rare but frequent enough for the Verkoning to send a small squadron of guards to help protect his citizens. These guards established a central base on a river in the western section of the woods. This settlement would eventually become the city of Deerwood, upon which the modern-day village of the same name is presently built. Ah, interesting. It's really a small village, yeah. Once that base was established, the first permanent Adiran settlements began north and west of the Bale River. Over the next 3 years, thousands of Adirans made the trek from Adir to this new land. The Glenfathans, who seemed to revere the ruins scattered throughout the forest, caused a few problems with some of the settlements, especially those founded near the ruins themselves. These were easily taken care of by the colonists with the help of the Imperial Guard. The Adirans, in order to further their foothold in the area, reduced the cost of production, and in an attempt to keep the Glenfathan population under control, started making slaves out of the Glenfathans captured during their uprisings. This resulted in a great increase in tensions between the two groups, obviously. With the population of the area growing, an official governmental structure was established by the Verkoning. He appointed several earls to preside over the land, and assigned to them thanes to help run their territories. And they called the new Griefron the Deerwood. Deerwood remained the center for the Imperial Guard, but the settlement in Purple Gulf, New Dunwood, was the true seat of power for the area. Sitting on the edge of the ocean, forests, fertile farmlands, and a river that runs from the coast to the White Marsh, settlers flocked to the area, hoping to establish names for themselves. Adir began to spread across the new land. Okay, I wonder if that city is Defiance Bay that they talked about at the end there. Part 2, The Broken Stone War. Before we begin reading this, I am going to take a quick break. I'll be right back. Alright, I'm back. Let's go ahead and keep on reading. The Deerwood, Part 2, The Broken Stone War, which we have read a lot about already. Let's see if it gives us any new information. In 2626 AI, a group of farmers, while clearing farmland for planting, accidentally knocked down one of the ancient Andra menhirs on their land. This innocent act drew the ire of the native population and started what would become known as the Broken Stone War. When it was finally over, several thousand colonists have been killed, as well as hundreds of the Glenfathans. Even though the war was technically over, the Glenfathans escalated their attacks on the settlers over the next 2 years using vicious tactics that left many colonists, several military figures, an earl, and 6 thanes dead. Unable to stop the Glenfathan attacks, the Earl elected Earl Edring Hadret to the position of Grief. Well respected and known to be a master of military tactics, he was tasked with dealing with the Glenfathan threat. Edring fought with the Glenfathans, led by an Orland named Regd, for the next 2 years. Neither side can gain the upper hand on the other, resulting in a tense stalemate between the two groups. Because of this stalemate, the hostilities slowly died off, and in 2631, the Deerwooden people signed a treaty with the Glenfathans. Regd would step down, the Glenfathans would stop their attacks altogether, and the Deerwooden people would leave the ruins alone. This treaty angered the nobility in Adir, as it brought to a halt the supply of artifacts. Edring also tried to get the practice of slavery outlawed, but this was not successful. Because of this, the peace between the Deerwood and Ir Glenfath is uneasy and tumultuous. Small patches of rural violence still cropped up, but were easily dealt with as neither side wanted another war. Until Part 3, The Rise of the Black Trees and the Rise of Admeth Hadret. Wait, what? The War of the Black Trees. The War of Black Trees and the Rise of Admeth Hadret. There we go. Alright, this one's got a little bit more to it. After the Broken Stone War, the Deerwood would see peace and prosperity for 21 years. Aside from the occasional slave uprising or border dispute, nothing of any note happened until 2652 AI. Some of the Deerwooden earls tired of being restricted by the treaties and encouraged by imperial sources, defied the decrees and actively sent people to loot the ruins in the Deerwood. Response from the Glenfathans was not immediate, but when it came, it was brutal and bloody. There was a slave uprising, and Regd resumed control of his guerrilla fighters. A contingent of Delimgan joined the forces as well, making the fights in the forest even more deadly for the Deerwooden soldiers. Edring, then far too old to lead Deerwood in the war, sent his son Admeth to deal with the situation. Admeth, showing the same tactical prowess as his father, set fire to the forest at the Eskuar River, and then blocks the forces retreating from the Inferno. Some of the Glenfathans escape, but thousands would die in the blaze. Regd is captured and sent to holding in New Hiamar. Man, the tenses in this is kind of bad, I feel. Maybe I'm not reading it. Maybe, I don't know. This goes on for several months, and Admeth uses the same tactics many times to flush Glenfathans and Delimgan from the battlefield. The entire war lasts less than a year. The Deerwood eventually wins, but at a terrible price. The conflict would come to be known as the War of Black Trees. They don't tell us what that price is. Is it just like the destruction of the land? Tragedy struck the Deerwood in 2654 when Edring, whose health had been waning, succumbed and passed into the cycle. Regd, who had developed a begrudging respect for his constant adversary over the years they had fought, sent Admeth his sincere condolences from captivity in New Hiamar. Admeth assumed his father's place as Grief over the Deerwood. The other earls disliked this development and began publicly rebuking Admeth's decrees. In 2655 AI, Admeth, tired of the problems caused by the recalcitrant earls, but having supported the new Valian dukes and the common folk of Deerwood, having saved them from the Glenfathans, delivers an ultimatum to the Furconing of Adir. He demands to be made a Grief Palatine. This move would give him authority and power over all the earls, their holdings, and their titles. Deerwood would become a palatinate instead of a grief firm. The Verkoning, who did not want to have to deal with a rebellion while trying to establish a hold on the Vorless trade network in Red Saris, begrudgingly agreed to Admeth's demands. Admeth would use this new power to bring all the earls in line. As a trade-off for being given the power, Admeth put the money and resources into all the Deerwood's ports to increase shipping traffic. In turn, this increased the Verkoning's income. Yep, we know this. Under Admeth's rule, the Deerwood saw 7 productive and profitable years. In 2662 AI, he did what had been tried for many years without success, bringing slavery to an end in the Deerwood. He negotiated the 10 Years' Treaties, so called because it had been 10 years since the War of Black Trees. A timeline was established in which the slaves will be released. The owners would be compensated with money or land for each slave released. If they did not comply, the slaves would be taken, and a fine will be levied against the owner. In return, the Glenfathans would... Yeah, the tenses are terrible. The Glenfathans would open trade with the Deerwood and cede some of their territories to the Deerwood government. In practice, meaning they would stop contesting the presence of those who lived and ruled there. Hundreds of Coopers attempted to rebel against this. Admeth, expecting just such a reaction, reacted accordingly, and the rebellion was quickly crushed. His agents then spread propaganda through the populace, making the Coopers' rebellion and its instigators seemed far worse than they truly were. This tactic worked, and there would be no more trouble. Oh. Okay, next up, Hadret's Rebellion. Part 4 of the Deerwood in history. Alright, the rural communities loved Admeth Hadret, considering him the best leader they'd ever had. In Adir, the Verkoning rankled against his usurpations of imperial authority, but no longer had the necessary power to truly undo anything that had happened. 2 years later, in 2664 AI, the Verkoning found allies willing to explore the ruins against the treaty conditions, and plundered them for their artifacts. This was done discreetly at first, but they eventually became careless. The agents were discovered and arrested, but there was no evidence pointing back to the Verkoning. Admeth, suspecting the truth, used Glenfathan Brishogwyn, mind hunters, the progenitors of modern-day ciphers, to investigate the matter further. With this method of interrogation, he discovered a chain of evidence all the way back to the Verkoning. While he investigated, many rural communities suffered retaliatory attacks by Glenfathans. Armed with this new information, Admeth worked with Galvin Medra, the new leader of the Glenfathans, and the rural communities of Deerwood to prevent the Verkoning's agents from entering the ruins. There was a back and forth between the two groups, both sides engaging in various political, economic, and military maneuvers to try and gain the upper hand. The Verkoning was at a disadvantage in this game, though, as he preferred to assert his authority without causing an uprising. Eventually, Admeth had enough. He convinced 7 of the 9 earls to join him, and they severed their allegiance to the Verkoning, declaring themselves independent and decreed they would govern themselves just as the Valian republics did 20 years prior. Admeth told the people he had tired of policies that made the nobles rich while putting the people of the Deerwood at risk. He declared himself a duke, again modeled after the Valian Republic's governing structure, and called the Deerwood a free palatinate. Thus began the War of Defiance in 2668 AI. The war lasted 4 years and caused countless casualties, including Admeth himself. The Deerwoodans, with their Glenfathan allies, were able to persevere. Glenfathan astrologers, alongside the Deerwoodan forces and members of the ad hoc Knights of the Crucible militia, won the Battle of Defiance Bay, which became the last battle of the war and left Deerwood free from Adiran imperial rule. 7 of the 9 earls of the Deerwood survived, and unified in purpose, signed treaties with the Verkoning of Adir. The war gave the Deerwood a greater sense of unity between its citizens and the Glenfathan allies. Admeth Hadrit was revered both by both groups, and the Deerwood enjoyed for the first time a nationwide fellowship of independence, perseverance, and sacrifice. Yenwood and Sinsrun were dissolved and incorporated into the surrounding earldoms, leaving 7: Hellsgate, the Grasp, Tin Firths, Norwich, Coldwater, Ashfall, and Bellreach. New Dunrid was renamed Defiance Bay and would become the seat of power for the new Duke in Bellreach. The new Duke's rule began in 2672 AI. Good. Alright, Part 5, The Proliferation of Animancy. Animancy, outlawed while under the Deer rule, was technically no longer a taboo after Hadrit's rebellion. Academics began its study again in earnest in 2681 AI. By 2697 AI, there were almost 40 academics actively researching the field, both in the Deerwood and the Valian republics, even though no significant results had been discovered. A tragic breakthrough of sorts happened in 2704 AI. An animancer working in Bellreach accidentally shattered the souls of about 8 volunteers who had been helping him. In retaliation for the death, the citizens of the area stormed his house and killed him. The Earl of the region, not wanting to waste resources or anger the locals any more than they already were, did nothing to find the head of the vigilante mob. But neither did he outlaw animancy. To ensure their own safety, most animancers moved from rural areas where they were studying and settled in Defiance Bay, many of them choosing the emerging and wealthy district of Breckenberry as their new home of operations. Well, we know how that turned out. While there were still a few breakthroughs, and the study of animancy continued for the next 24 years, it quickly slowed as it became cost prohibitive and complicated the more people learned about it. Most animancers couldn't afford to continue research without the support of donations or gifts from wealthy individuals and organizations. In 2737 AI, some animancers, desperate to continue their studies and seeing no other means of furthering their research, entered the forbidden ruins of Irglampath to further their research. They discovered some such sites had strange artifacts that seemed to bear affinity to soul essence, and began to prod the devices for further insight. Even with continued research, they are unable to tell quite what they have discovered. Eventually, they were found out by the Glenfathans, who captured some of them, demanding that they be punished for their crimes. The Deerwood authorities, in order to maintain their treaties and keep the peace, had no choice. They allowed the animancers to be executed according to Glenfathan traditions. This led the Duke to make an additional proclamation. The study and practice of animancy on or even near the sacred Glenfathan sites would be punishable by death. You know what I just realized? Why did the Glenfathans allow Defiance Bay to be there? I mean, maybe they couldn't stop it, but... And was it Hadrit's Hill? Wherever we went with the Glenfathan Tower, right in the city. Now, how was that possible? Why was that allowed? I don't remember if we ever heard anything about that. In 2780 AI, in order to solidify relations again with the Glenfathans, the Deerwood government allowed some animancers to begin training and experiments in conjuration with the Glenfathan Mindhunters, their native ciphers. This was an exchange of information. The animancers documented the secrets of the Mindhunters' powers. The Mindhunters learned new techniques for concentration, which assisted them in taking their powers to a level no Glenfathan had ever seen before. The ciphers, no longer weary of animancers' intentions, trusted them to such a level that they convinced the Glenfathans to give some animancers limited access to some of the training sites where the Glenfathans practiced. The Anamfaths of the Glenfathan tribes opened the training grounds to the animancers. They were not allowed inside, as this was still strictly forbidden, but the general allowances by the Glenfathans were seen as a breakthrough in relations between the Deerwood and Ir Glenfath. Over the next 80 years, the Animancer's research would continue unimpeded. With the exception of some minor squabbles, there has been no major strife between the two groups for almost 120 years since. Well, that's good. Alright, the final book in the history of the Deerwood, The Saints' War and Widewind's Legacy. So it's a big one, I bet. In 2807 AI, war returned to the Deerwood. Saint Widewind, transformed supposedly into a living incarnation of Aothus, marched on the Deerwood from Red Ceres, beginning the Saints' War. The Deerwood rallied at Halgut Citadel and took the battle to him in Red Ceres, attempting to prevent as much damage to their own land as they could. Even though there were devastating losses for the Deerwooden forces, using Hadrit's military techniques combined with Galvin Reg's strategies, they were able to secure a few victories for themselves as well. Red Saren forces made their way into the Deerwood through White March, unopposed by the locals of Cold Morn, leaving Mercy Vale burned and devastated. The contempt the Deerwoodens have for Cold Morn for this betrayal lasts well after the war ends. Desperate to end the war and eliminate Saint Widewind, Magrinic clergy of Deerwood developed a special bomb that was hidden beneath the bridge at Halgut Citadel, intending to lure Widewind to the bridge and then detonate it. Their ploy succeeded, and Saint Widewind was completely destroyed, along with most of the forces with him, and the entire bridge. The 12 Deerwooden men and women who volunteered to delay Saint Widewind on the bridge were also lost, their sacrifice and martyrdom celebrated by the Deerwood in ensuing years. The bomb would come to be known as the Godhammer, and soon after the battle, the citadel was renamed Godhammer Citadel. Saint Widewind's forces were easily routed after his death, and Deerwood set about rebuilding from the first major conflict in over a century. In retaliation for Saint Widewind's actions on Aothus's part, many Aothusian followers were purged from Deerwood and communities or driven out via social pressure. Less than a year after the devastation of the Saints' War, tragedy hit again. In 2809 AI, the first Hollowborn was reported in the Deerwood. Many of these poor creatures died within weeks or months of being born. The outcry from the populace calls for blame or punishment be leveled against someone, whether it be the gods, the mothers, the government, or the Euthesian followers. Responding to great socio-political pressure to try and help the Hollowborn Animancers developed a process to transplant animal souls into the infants, because nothing would go wrong with that idea, that they might develop survival instincts and even a basic personality. The process seemed successful, so it was repeated on tens of thousands. Tens of thousands! Jesus! That's a lot of Hollowborn, even though many Animancers disagreed with the technique, worried about the ethical implications. These protests were largely ignored and discounted. The process was soon named Salvation, and the Hollowborns given souls this way were called the Saved. 5 years after the first Hollowborn, an Orlan girl is saved. She entered 5 years after the first Hollowborn, an Orlan girl is saved. Okay, I understand. She entered puberty. In a matter of mere weeks, she transformed into a ravenous feral creature devoid of all conscience. Soon, all of the saved would experience the same fate. Each one, upon reaching puberty, would transform into what the locals called wicks, uncontrollable children. After researching the problem, Animancers discovered an incompatibility, no kidding, between the animal souls and the children's bodies. This fueled the parents' anger, as many of them had to kill their wicked children. Jesus. The Animancers responsible were widely denounced, and many of them were dragged from their homes, beaten, and in many cases, killed. Most surviving Animancers left the rural areas en masse and headed to Defiance Bay. Others left the area completely, moving to the Valian Republics to study in peace. Yeah, tens of thousands. That's a lot. All right. So that's it for the Deerwooden history. Next we have the enigmatic god of cold. So this is Rimmergand, right? Young students are often confused by Barath and Rimmergand's seemingly overlapping roles in holding dominion over death. Barath oversees the cycle of life, and death and rebirth. Rimergon oversees the cold, destructive act of death itself. The difference is often difficult for novices to appreciate until they've lost a loved one and endured the absence for a time. It is Baroth that determines we will be reborn just as certainly as we will die, but Rimergon is the executioner's axe. Rimergon shows us that all life ends in stillness. I need only show them the symbol of Rimergon, the bone-white auroch skull found carved within the most ancient of Ingwithan ruins. It is a symbol of death and doom in every culture. Every child with 4 winters under his belt needs no introduction to the ancient symbol. Rimergon embodies not just death, but all manifestations of collapse, be they famine, plague, or simple bad luck. Rimergon is a primal god, silent and inscrutable as death itself. He makes himself known with his passing, not by proclamation. There are innumerable stories of the god's terrifying passage through the lands of Aora. When the beast of winter stirs, bitter winds and beastly howling follow the creature's every move. Wherever the beast plants a hoof, all life withers into dust. The faithful of Rimergon insist that even another god's life can end in stillness. They claim the other gods must flee from the beast of winter's mastery over death, but we know not if this boast holds true. Though the beast of winter is shrouded in snowy clouds, those who have seen the shaggy white monster claim that the souls of the fallen can be seen clinging or perhaps frozen to the beast's fur. The dwarves of the boreal south have numerous stories that tell a similar plot. A brash hero seeks out the beast of winter to rescue the souls trapped in its fur. These tales never end well, for even if the hero saves the beloved soul, the hero dies in the process, for it is not a proper tale of Rimergon unless the hero's life ends in stillness. Yeah, not a good one, huh? The Fangs. As I have stated, not much is known about this group by the world at large because they don't welcome outsiders into their numbers. While many believe they are xenophobic and openly hostile to all who enter Irglanfath, the truth doesn't seem to be as broad or deadly, and certainly not that simple. There are many places in Irglanfath that could be called magical or sacred to the Glanfathans. One legend states that the Ingwithans, who had suddenly abandoned their kingdom and left for places unknown, took the time to guide the ancient Glanfathan tribes into the now vacant land. The Glanfathans were gifted with the fertile area as their new homeland, but in return for being given such a gift, an oath was required. The Glanfathans were instructed to protect the Ingwithan ruins until such time as they could return and reclaim the ruins. They were required to swear that no living person, including the Glanfathans themselves, would be permitted entrance into the ruins. Differing accounts suggest that the Glanfathans were promised more than a homeland, that the Ingwithans were the favored people of the gods, and that keeping their oaths would confer similar benefits to the Glanfathans in the end. Oddly, the rules do not seem to apply as strictly within the borders of the Twin Elms, a site built upon a large concentration of Ingwithan structures, but it would seem that this is unlikely a selective oversight on the parts of the Glanfathans, and more probably part of the terms of the original compact. In any case, the Glanfathans came to take the role as guardians seriously, rearing the sites and developing rituals designed to protect and guard the ruins. Over time, these rituals became rote formality to some, as much legend and superstition as any other stories passed down. This is not to say the Glanfathans ceased all attempts to uphold their oaths. See the section about the 10 Years Treaties in my book about Admeth Hadrit. Well, these are all written by the same guy. But the intense devotion to the oath tended to vary from tribe to tribe and clan to clan. Not so with the Fangs, however. The Fangs are a group joined not by ties of kinship or even community, but of belief. Of all the groups of Irglanfath, it is the Fangs who seem most intent on keeping the promise their ancestors made to the Ingwithans. Just because their fanaticism and zeal are not as widely sweeping as many think does not make them any less dangerous. The Fangs are not known to reason with those they view as transgressors. If they feel you have in any way have violated the sanctity of a sacred place, their judgment is swift and exact. Reports of the Fangs' attacks can be found in records dating back to the first colonial explorations of Irglampath, and even the smallest of a perceived slight can be worthy of execution. The Order itself seems to consist mainly of hunters. Whether they are recruited as skilled hunters or trained once they gain access to the Order, it is unknown. From all accounts, once they join the Fangs, hunting game falls second behind the patrolling Irglampath and protecting the ruins. So it is the author's opinion that it is the former. All right. The Great Western Stag.